By the end of 007 First Light, James Bond can enter a room, read the danger, improvise a plan, survive the collapse of that plan, and leave with the confidence of a man who will absolutely explain the property damage later. He has the gadgets, the car, the charm, the license, the support network, and finally the number.
Bit over the top, perhaps.
You just wait and see.
But those things answer the easy question. Does the game make him recognizable as James Bond? The harder question is whether it actually changes him. Because the man we meet in Iceland already has most of the qualities that define this version of Bond. He is brave, resourceful, reckless, idealistic, quick under pressure, and almost physically incapable of waiting for a committee to reach the correct conclusion.
You see, I strongly believe that there is still a need for such human flourishes as heart and intuition in modern spycraft. In fact, that's the very reason I'm bringing back the Double O's.
MI6 does not install those qualities. It gives them procedure, equipment, targets, and a very expensive building to endanger. That distinction matters because character development is not the same thing as professional development. A person can become more skilled, better dressed, more trusted, and more effective without changing the belief that governs his choices. And that is where First Light becomes interesting. I think this game gives Bond a strong formation arc and a less complete internal one. It convincingly shows how a gifted but undisciplined serviceman becomes an operational 00 agent. It is less convincing when it asks us to believe that the man inside the suit has fundamentally matured. The identity is earned. The transformation is incomplete. This video is about the difference. Before judging the arc, we need to be fair about what the writers were trying to build. Main writer Michael Vogt described Bond as someone who grows without changing fundamentally, and said the story is also about Bond changing MI6. So First Light is closer to a formation arc, or even a positive flat arc, than a personality conversion. The essential Bond is present from the beginning. Pressure teaches him how to use those qualities, while the institution learns their value. That can still be a meaningful arc. A character does not need to become his opposite to develop. There is also a second kind of origin story operating here. Not just how Bond enters MI6, but which version of Bond this game chooses to inherit. First Light is not a literal adaptation of a Fleming novel. IO Interactive calls it a standalone, reimagined origin. But it is unusually explicit about parts of Fleming's character dossier that the films often soften, omit, or leave buried in backstory. Fleming's Bond is ex-Royal Navy. He is an orphan of Scottish and Swiss descent. He attended Eton. His body carries history, including a 3-inch vertical scar down his right cheek, another scar on his shoulder, and signs of surgery on his hand. The game does not confirm every one of those biographical details in this new continuity, so we should not pretend that it does. What it chooses to foreground is still revealing. The scar is visibly present on Bond's right cheek, and the Royal Navy background is no longer a line in a service record. It becomes his opening identity. We meet Bond before MI6 has completed his professional formation, and the failed Iceland operation becomes the bridge between those lives. That is closer to Fleming in texture, especially compared with the broad screen tradition that usually introduces Bond after the institution has already finished shaping him. It is not a universal victory over the films. Skyfall preserves the orphaned Scottish history, and No Time to Die retains Commander Bond's naval identity. The difference is one of emphasis. First Light puts selected literary details on Bond's face and inside the playable origin. But source fidelity and character development are not the same test. The scar tells us which history this Bond inherits. It does not tell us whether the story changes him. John Truby gives us a useful test for how deep that development goes. Weakness and need, desire, a character web that attacks the weakness a battle where the old method fails, then self-revelation, moral choice, and a new equilibrium. First Light handles some of those steps much better than others. Bond's desire is clear: earn his place, prove that he belongs in the 00 program, and become the agent he already suspects he can be. His weakness also appears clear. He is reckless, insubordinate, overconfident, and too willing to trust his own reading over the chain of command. But the game immediately complicates that weakness because his instinct is also the quality that saves people, exposes bad intelligence, and eventually protects MI6. So I am tracking 3 ladders: capability, responsibility for others, and recognition that his original worldview was incomplete. The first ladder is excellent, the second is meaningful. The third is where the game struggles. Iceland is an unusually efficient introduction because it gives Bond's flaw and his gift the same source. He begins as a Royal Navy air crewman, caught inside a mission that is already going wrong. He survives, reads the danger, moves toward the people at risk, improvises under pressure, and refuses to accept the narrow limits of his instructions. It is reckless. It is also heroic. This is the central contradiction the entire game needs to solve. If MI6 removes the part of Bond that ignores procedure, it may also remove the part that notices when procedure is failing. If it simply rewards that instinct, then the supposed weakness never becomes a weakness at all. The sequence gives us real consequences. Bond does not execute a clean operation. The rescue is destructive, improvised, and much larger than the job he was meant to perform. He behaves like a man who believes that a good result can justify the route taken to reach it.
Initially willing to assist, but then you hang up on us. Go against direct orders, and ultimately blow up the invaluable asset we were there to retrieve.
I wasn't aware I was under MI6 command, and I just chose not to take your advice.
That combination is why MI6 notices him. And it is also why the opening does not establish a simple correction arc. Bond is not recruited despite the thing he did wrong. He is recruited because the thing he did wrong revealed exactly what the program needs. From a Truby perspective, this is strong character design. A useful weakness should not be detachable from the hero's strength. Bond cannot become disciplined by becoming passive. He has to learn the difference between impulsive action and responsible judgment. But the story now owes us proof of that difference. By the end, we should be able to compare 2 moments that look similar on the surface. Bond disobeys an instruction, and understand that the later decision comes from greater knowledge, humility, and responsibility. The game does eventually give us that comparison. It just takes a long route through professional training first. The MI6 and Malta chapters are where First Light is most successful as an origin story because the player and Bond develop together. Bond learns the institution's rules while we learn the game's systems. Observation, social access, weapons, gadgets, movement, close combat, tactical judgment, and team procedure are not delivered only through exposition. They become things the player has to perform. That makes the training more than a tutorial. It turns professional formation into playable evidence. We do not simply watch Bond become more competent. Competence accumulates in our hands. Greenway is essential here. He sees the danger inside Bond's talent more clearly than the admiring people around him. Bond can solve a problem, but he can also create a second problem while solving the first. Greenway's job is to teach him that a mission is not a personal stage, and that being right does not erase the cost of being uncontrolled.
Yes, until you get bored or the work's too hard. I read your file. To do this, you need skill, discipline, and above all, dedication. Pure dumb luck will only get you so far.
Glad we got that covered.
This relationship gives the early arc shape. Greenway represents procedure, experience, and restraint. Bond represents instinct, possibility, and the irritating fact that the trainee often sees what the instructor misses. The supporting cast turns Bond into an institutional character. Q gives his resourcefulness a technical language. Moneypenny makes his confidence social rather than merely physical. M defines a program larger than his ambition. The other recruits give him a team he can impress, fail, and eventually mourn. Recognizable Bond behavior also emerges through systems. He reads rooms, listens, bluffs, finds restricted routes, and treats a broken plan as material for the next one. This matters because a suit and an Aston Martin are iconography. Observation and improvisation are character. And yet First Light understands that iconography becomes more persuasive when it is attached to behavior. The clearest example is almost comically small. Before the Vietnam operation, Bond stands in front of a mirror, and the player participates as he refines his bow tie and collar. The hands settle the fabric. The posture changes. The final glance checks whether the public surface is under control. It is the familiar cuff and collar grammar of Bond, but converted into an action rather than a costume reveal. The game lets us perform the ritual of composure. That is good characterization. It shows Bond learning how to construct the polished exterior that later appears effortless, but it is still external development. A corrected bow tie is not a self-revelation. The ritual makes the icon playable. It does not prove that the man underneath has changed. Still, most of this is external development. Bond becomes better at operating. He learns the grammar of espionage. His body, tools, situational awareness, and tactical options become more sophisticated, but charm is already there. Courage is already there. Idealism is already there. The willingness to ignore a bad instruction is definitely already there. MI6 is sharpening Bond more than rewriting him. And once he enters the field, the story begins testing whether that sharpening has changed how he handles failure. The Slovakia operation should be the point where confidence meets irreversible cost. Bond is no longer improvising alone in an emergency. He is part of an MI6 operation. Other people are depending on the team, and the team is depending on him to understand the mission rather than merely survive it. The hotel sequence initially lets his developing spycraft lead. He observes, follows, listens, and reads pressure before the operation breaks into violence. Then the mission collapses. Monroe is killed. Cressida is injured. Beckett, the former 009, becomes the apparent center of the disaster.
Second in the son of a bitch was 009. Of course, it was a bloody suicide mission. He used himself as bait to get to me, and now... There! That's him! Bond, go! I'll take care of her. Don't let him get away.
Eyes on the prize, James.
This is where a deep transformation arc might force Bond to ask whether his need to act made the loss worse and whether he can admit it. First Light does give him grief and pressure, but the larger plot quickly moves toward another conclusion. The official explanation is wrong. The evidence around Beckett does not fit. In Mauritania, Bond continues investigating, while the institution tries to stabilize the story and close the case. He distrusts the convenient culprit, follows the contradiction, and discovers that the system is protecting a false answer.
M's making a mistake. She needs to issue a full-scale mole hunt, top to bottom. If there's a breach...
We'll find it. Why do you think she sent everyone home? MI6 aren't idiots, James. We managed just fine before you came along.
You sound like Greenway.
Just go home. Go for a run.
This is compelling spy drama. It also creates a problem for the character arc. Bond's defining flaw is that he trusts his own judgment over authority. The plot then proves that his judgment is better than authority, again. His detractors do not defeat his worldview. They are forced to update theirs. Bond still learns. Loss makes him suspicious of easy certainty, and he separates loyalty to the mission from obedience to the institution. But this refines the belief he carried in Iceland. When instructions and the person in danger diverge, trust the human reality in front of you. The story changes the meaning of his disobedience more than its existence. Early Bond moves because movement is natural. Later Bond moves with evidence, relationships, and a clearer sense of what inaction will cost. That is real maturation. It is also subtler than the game sometimes claims, because the external world keeps arranging itself to confirm that Bond was the necessary exception. And nobody reveals that tension more clearly than Greenway. If we apply Truby's framework to the supporting cast, an awkward possibility appears. Greenway may have the clearer internal arc. At the beginning, Greenway believes in control because he has lived through the cost of uncontrolled operations. He sees Bond as a talented liability. Procedure is not bureaucracy to him, it is the structure that keeps people alive. But Greenway also carries a deeper wound. The intelligence system he trusted was compromised. Thea falsely identified agents and threats. He followed information presented as institutional certainty, and people died because obedience felt safer than judgment. That revelation attacks Greenway's governing belief directly. He cannot dismiss the truth as the mistake of an impulsive recruit. He has to confront the possibility that his discipline became moral surrender when he stopped questioning the machine behind the order.
There was no mole ring. Thea drew a false conclusion, so Webb made it true. He framed 009 and the others. They never betrayed anyone. You couldn't have known.
This is classic self-revelation territory. Greenway begins by treating Bond's heart as a risk to be contained. He ends by recognizing that the institution needs precisely the human quality its systems cannot calculate. Bond changes Greenway, and Greenway changes Bond by giving responsibility a human face. Their relationship moves beyond instructor and nuisance. Bond learns that discipline is not the same as blind obedience, while Greenway learns that instinct is not the same as selfishness. Each man corrects the other's extreme. The Vietnam material gives that exchange its emotional payoff. By then, Greenway is no longer evaluating whether Bond can fit inside the program. He is deciding what part of Bond must survive the program. It works.
Why did you come back for me? I thought you hated heroics.
Turns out I was wrong about that. You've got heart, Bond. You're just what we need right now. I don't know why
The performance, history, and sacrifice give the scene weight. But notice where the revelation comes from. Greenway tells Bond what makes him valuable. The mentor recognizes the truth and gives it to the hero. Bond receives validation more clearly than he articulates a discovery about himself. That is why the scene is emotionally strong, but structurally incomplete as Bond's self-revelation. It resolves Greenway's view of Bond. It does not force Bond to name a mistaken belief and choose against it. The wider character Webb follows the same pattern. M, Q, and Moneypenny learn to work with Bond's unorthodox rhythm. Isola tests his trust without becoming a stable source of change. By the late game, the people around Bond have revised their judgment of him more decisively than he has revised his judgment of himself. The clearest gap in Bond's internal development appears around violence. First Light briefly presents lethal force as a threshold. A young recruit who has not yet become a licensed killer is forced into a life-or-death situation. The moment suggests that becoming 007 will involve more than improved aim. It will require a new relationship with consequence.
What is this now? You want to blow us up
Yeah, thinking about it.
and destroy the asset? MI6 would never.
I'm not MI6.
Then the campaign moves on. Once the license to kill opens the action, Bond can eliminate large numbers of enemies with very little psychological residue. The mechanical escalation is entertaining and often spectacular. It also weakens the moral line the origin story briefly introduces. We see him become more efficient at violence. We see less evidence that he becomes more thoughtful about it. This matters because a Truby-style moral arc is proved through action. If restraint is Bond's need, the late story should force him to choose it when violence would be easier, or accept a cost because he understands what uncontrolled force does. Stealth, bluffing, gadgets, precision, and improvisation can delay open combat, expressing a broader Bond identity than firepower. But the story rarely turns those choices into moral evidence. Careful play and an extraordinary body count do not meaningfully alter how the arc reads him. The result is a split. The professional arc says, Bond has learned when and how to use force. The internal arc often says, Bond is still the man who acts decisively because hesitation is dangerous. That may be faithful to the iconic character. It is less satisfying if the promise is a deep origin of the man behind the icon. And yet the late game does contain one decision that proves more than capability. Bond returns to protect an institution that has failed to trust him. Antarctica is not important to the arc simply because Bond goes rogue. He has been going outside instructions since Iceland. What changes is the responsibility attached to the decision. Early Bond acts on instinct in the middle of immediate danger. Late Bond acts after training, loss, compromised intelligence, institutional conflict, and a clearer understanding of what failure will cost. He pursues the truth with Isola not because rebellion is exciting, but because every official route has been shaped by the system they are investigating. That is a more mature form of the same trait. He has not learned obedience. He has learned what disobedience is for. The confrontation with Webb, Thea, Damien, and Isola tests judgment. Data can classify, institutions can authorize, and rivals can manipulate. None can remove the need for a person to decide whom to trust and what consequence to accept. Isola's final move also prevents the story from making Bond's instinct infallible. He can choose the right mission and still misread another person's complete agenda. Trust remains dangerous. Then the story gives Bond its best evidence of responsibility. MI6 has constrained him, doubted him, and treated him as part of the problem. He still returns when the institution and the people inside it are threatened.
No need. I just watched you take down a handful of intruders. I'm not sure which side you're on, Bond, but it's clearly not theirs.
How did this happen?
You need an earpiece. The man you just fought was tuned into our frequency. Grab his. I'll update you on the way. And I'm reactivating your Q lens. You'll need all the help you can get.
Thank you, Mom. I was feeling rather naked without it.
This is stronger than another act of defiance because Bond is choosing connection. He protects a flawed institution because its purpose and people still matter. That is the late decision that most clearly separates mature judgment from youthful impulse. The final battle is physically enormous, but its character value is simple. Bond is fighting for a mission larger than his own recognition. And after the crisis, the grave scene turns professional recognition into identity. M offers him a number. Bond chooses 007, the 7th recruit in the revived program.
Congratulations. I suppose this makes you 001.
Wouldn't be right. Actually, Mom, I thought since I was the 7th recruit.
Happens to be my lucky number. Perhaps you'd be so kind as to do some digging. 007.
Mom, I thought you'd never ask.
The moment works because the number arrives after the behavior: training, failure, the false case, conspiracy, Greenway's loss, the rogue mission, and the defense of MI6. The iconography is attached to experience, but the number confirms who he is more than it proves he has become someone fundamentally different. The young man in Iceland ran toward danger because people needed help, and the instruction was inadequate. The new 007 does the same thing with better tools, deeper relationships, greater knowledge, and more willingness to carry the cost. That is growth. It is not reinvention. So, how well does 007 First Light develop James Bond? Good, but not completely. The professional arc is excellent. Training, observation, spycraft, gadgets, combat, social confidence, and improvisation become playable. By the end, Bond operates differently because both he and the player understand more. The identity work is excellent too. The Navy opening, the scar, the social rituals, and even that mirror-bound adjustment of the bow tie and collar make this Bond feel connected to Fleming while still belonging to an original continuity. The game does not merely hand him the surface at the end. It lets the player practice becoming that surface. But again, identity work is not automatically interchange. The relational arc is meaningful. Greenway, M, Q, Moneypenny, the recruits, and Isola give him attachments the isolated serviceman did not carry. Returning to defend MI6 makes belonging a choice rather than a reward. The internal arc is weaker. Bond's central instinct is rarely dismantled. He breaks procedure, trusts his own reading, risks himself for people, and keeps moving when the institution hesitates. The story repeatedly reveals that this is exactly what MI6 needs. His worldview is refined, disciplined, and legitimized. It is not deeply overturned. Greenway receives the sharper self-revelation. He discovers the danger of obedience without judgment. MI6 changes its understanding of what a 00 agent should be. Bond becomes the agent of that change. That is why calling this a formation arc is not an excuse. It is the most accurate description of what the game accomplishes. First Light is not the story of a reckless man learning to obey. It is the story of a reckless man learning to make his disobedience responsible, and of an institution learning that rules without human judgment can become another kind of recklessness. The final number is therefore earned. Not because Bond has completed some perfect moral transformation, but because he has learned how to carry the qualities he started with inside a mission, a team, and a consequence larger than himself. The suit fits, the gadgets fit, the confidence fits. Most importantly, the responsibility begins to fit. But the man inside them is still on a trajectory. And perhaps that is the most honest place for a first chapter to leave James Bond. Recognizable, capable, visibly scarred, emotionally wounded, validated, and not yet finished. The identity is earned. The transformation is incomplete. Did Bond truly change in First Light, or did MI6 finally learn how to see the man who was already there? Tell me what convinced you, or what the game failed to prove in the comments, and subscribe for the next Gamers Anonymous case file.